As well as I have fed mine, our minds must be well primed to be and ready to roll. So now it's time to sit back, relax, listen, and feed the mind. Once again, I have the great pleasure to introduce the man feared and disdained by Planned Parenthood, but loved and admired by pro-lifers. Please welcome Father Paul Marks, OSB, founder and president of Human Life International.
Thank you very much, sister. I'm glad you got that OSB right at Notre Dame University. He has written many books and good books on abortion that you can examine out in the corridor, and I'm sure you'd be glad to autograph some of them later on after the ceremonies tonight. When we in the United States want to know something of what we should do in a difficult circumstance having to do with abortion or euthanasia, we call Notre Dame, not Father McBrien, but Father, yes, he's a father too, Charles Rice, who is pro-life in many ways. He has 10 children. And he is our great pride and joy in the States. He has written much, and he has spoken in many places. He is called upon for all kinds of advice, and I happen to know he's thoroughly generous, though he has a full load of classes and lots of work to do. So tonight, I met him the first time in 1974 at the first World Population Conference in Bucharest in Romania. And I still see him in a jam session. He was sitting on the bed dispensing his great fund of information on this whole problem and question. So tonight I am very glad to present to you Dr. Charles Rice, who has written many books, has many credentials. I won't pause to mention them, and he will address you on a very important subject.
Thanks very much, Father Marks. Can you hear me out there? I'm not going to touch this thing. I don't want to get electrocuted. Can you hear me back there? Way over there? Okay. I appreciate the introduction. I should say that they're videotaping this thing. I don't know who might see it. He mentioned the 10 kids, and he left out the most important part, which is my wife, all right? We have 10 children, but I feel fine. I'm fine. And the reason I mention it is because just before I left South Bend, Just, can you still hear me? All right. What'd you say? I want to mention my bride because actually just before I left South Bend, I left South Bend. Let me tell you what I went through to get here. I came up here from Indiana by way of Washington, D.C. because it was believe it or not, with the schedules and everything, it was the cheapest and shortest way, fastest way to come up. And I started out on U.S. Air. As some people irreverently call it, U.S. Scare. You may have heard their slogans. U.S. Air, terrorists are afraid to fly with us. But The one I like is, we never make the same mistake 3 times. And anyway, I got up here, and just before I left, my bride said, look, I wish I could go with you, but I can't. But do this. And I tell you that if you don't mention me and make them applaud, I'll kill you. So I'm sitting here, and sitting over there, and Father Mark says, I have 10 children. Thanks a lot. In any event, I'm glad to be here, and I'm not going to talk at you very long, because I want, as much as you do, to see the Joan Andrews tape. I'd like to give you a few concepts, a few ideas, and maybe bring you up to date on what is happening in the United States. You may have heard that there is a Supreme Court decision that's going to be handed down this spring. And I don't want to give you a lecture in law, all right? I don't want to get into cases and all that business, but what is likely to happen is that the Supreme Court is likely to allow the states to regulate abortion to some greater extent. There is no prospect whatever that they're going to reverse Roe versus Wade on the basic holding. The basic holding is that the unborn child is not a person. That is, he is not a person and therefore has no constitutional rights. And that is the basic holding underlying all legalized abortion. And of course it leads to euthanasia. If you can describe or treat the little child in the womb as a non-person, you can do the same thing for his elder brother or his grandmother. So you're going to get probably a change in the rule in the U.S. so that we'll be able to go to state legislatures and get some restrictions on abortion. It's not satisfactory, because the only satisfactory rule is a total restoration of personhood to all human beings with respect to the right to life. And I don't think you can ask for anything less, and I think we're entitled to that. We'll fight with whatever we end up with, but I don't think we ever want to be in the position of asking for half a loaf and pretending that somehow we can compromise this issue, because we can't. I'll guarantee you that if you compromise it with respect to the little kid in the womb, you're going to compromise it, as they do in the United States, with respect to the elderly patient and the retarded. Now, your situation, you have a charter which in the preamble recognizes the supremacy of God. You have that really great factum presented to the Supreme Court by Mr. Shumiatra in the Joe Borowski case. And I don't know how it's going to go, and neither do you. And I'm not an expert on Canadian law. Your Constitution, like ours, protects the right to life and protects the equal protection of the laws. What's going to happen? I don't know. But again, I don't want to talk at you at great length. Let me just say this, that however the Joe Borowski case turns out, and you ought to give that man a vote of thanks in your prayers, however that case turns out, the fight is going to continue. Because the reality is that legalized abortion is a symptom, it's not the problem. It's a symptom of several things that have been happening, not just in the past few years, but over the course of the past 3 centuries. It's a symptom of the secularization of our law. We have gotten to the point where we've adopted the idea that law is totally separated from morality, that God's law does not control, You have it recognized in your Constitution. Our Supreme Court, less than 100 years ago, said that this is a Christian nation. That's all changed. You have secularism. People are living life and treating the law as if God doesn't exist, or as if he doesn't have a care for what goes on. The second thing is relativism. What do you mean? I mean the idea that we've lost sight of the fact that we can actually know what's right and wrong. You know this. I mean, I'll give you an example. In a geology class, of all things, at Notre Dame, a professor came in the first day of class, and the student that I know was in the back of the class, and the teacher said, "Look, I want you to understand the very first thing is that there are no absolutes." This little guy in the back put up his hand and said, "Are you absolutely sure of that?" But you see what it is? You're dealing with people that are absolutely sure that they can't be sure of anything. They know they can't know anything. And relativism leads in the legal area to a 50-cent phrase that we call legal positivism. Legal positivism simply refers to the idea that since we can't know what's right or wrong, as Hans Kelsen, the leading positivist jurisprudent of this century, said, he said, justice is an irrational ideal. Nobody can know what is just. So if you can't know what's right or wrong, what happens? You leave the decision of that question up to the political process. And Gustav Radbruch was a great German lawyer, minister of justice in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. And he was a thorough positivist. He had a change of heart during the war. He suffered for it. And after the war, he wrote, he said, you know, what happened was that when the Nazi government declared the Jews to be non-persons in 1935, they didn't formally do it, but in effect they did. He said the legal profession was disarmed. Why? Because the legal profession had adopted throughout the 1920s, before Hitler ever came into power, had adopted the idea that there's no such thing as right and wrong, and that law is just a question of power, and that there is such a thing as a life not worth living. And Radbruch argued for a return to natural justice, return to the higher law. And the West German courts after the Second World War did that in several notable cases, which we won't get into because of time. But incidentally, on any of these questions, if you have any questions on any of this stuff, drop me a line if I ever get home. The only address you need is Notre Dame Law School, Notre Dame, Indiana, 46556. But you can leave off the zip code and make the U.S. government work for a change. Let them figure it out. But if you have any questions on any of these things, let me know. I can send you anything but football tickets. But in any event, we ought to think about that. You wonder, you look at abortion and you say, well, how does it happen that every year in the U.S. we wipe out the combined populations of Kansas City, Miami, and Minneapolis, all right? I mean, how does it happen that this can be done, and that that's by surgical abortions. There's an estimated 6 to 8 million non-surgical abortions in addition. How have we reached that point? And really, it's simple. It's simple because it comes from the denial of God. We become secular. It comes from the denial of reason. We've adopted relativism. And we've adopted, as a result, the legal positivism, the idea that law is power, And it pervades our societies. You know that. Ask the average kid, the average high school kid. And I mean a pro-life kid. Not one that is involved, really, but generally pro-life kids say, well, hey, what do you think about abortion? You know what the answer is you're probably going to get? That kid will say, well, I don't agree with it, but I can't say it's wrong for anybody else. And we have, as a culture, really, if you think about it, we've taken leave of our senses. And we are responsible to a great extent because we've allowed it to happen without saying that it's baloney. It's simply dumb. We don't live the rest of our lives that way, you know? I mean, everybody knows, not only in his heart, but in his head, that everything has a nature. And that if you act contrary to the nature of the thing, it's not good for the thing. I suppose you came in here to this dinner, said, hey, first course, kerosene cocktail. Wow. Would you drink it? No, because it's not good for you, right? We know that. We apply that everywhere except in the moral realm. Right behind me is a wall, all right? It's there, whether I think it's there or not. Now, suppose I convince myself that that wall isn't there. And I decide that I'm going to exit in that direction. What happens? Instant headache, right? Because I can't change reality by the way I think. Well, this happens all the time. You know that. And why don't we apply it to abortion and these other issues? Suppose you went out of this hotel. You went across the street to the parking lot, right? You leave the hotel and you go out, you're walking out there with your friend Freddie, all right? This is a stupid example, but it's interesting. And I think it makes a point. You're out there and you turn around, you see Freddie has the hood of his car up, all right? What do they call it here, the bonnet? Hood, thank you. He's got the hood of his car up, right? He's holding two cans. One's oil and one's molasses. And you say, Freddie, what are you doing? He says, I'm trying to make up my mind which one to put in my car. All right? Now, if you were really a friend of Freddie's, what would you say to him? Would you say, well, Freddie, how do you feel about it? Would you? No, you know what you'd say? You'd say, Freddie, you should do good by your car. And the good is that which is in accord with the nature of the thing. It is good to put oil in a car. It is not good to put molasses in a car. And Freddie says, yeah, but this is a Chevy. I said, no. Then he turns to you and he says, yeah, hey, wait a minute. Whose car is this? This is my car. Who are you? How do you know? So you say, look. If you don't believe me, just look in the glove compartment. Look at the manufacturer's directions. That's all the Ten Commandments are. That's all the natural law is a set of manufacturer's directions. So he goes and he opens the thing up and he looks at it, and page 13, in red letters, it says, use oil. Do not use molasses. And he looks at that and he says, yeah, but wait a minute. Whose car is this? You've heard that. It's my body, right? Whose car is this? This is my car. I can do with it as I wish. So he puts the molasses in. He's pro-choice, right? He is. He's liberated, right? and he's also a pedestrian, right? Right. Why? Why? Because the natural law is simply the story of how things work, right? I mean, we have a manufacturer who has given us a natural law. Why? So that we can work, so that we can be happy. That's what it is. When you look at it, you say, well, I want to do what I want. You know what you're being? You're being an Enlightenment creature. Father Frank Canavan from Fordham had a marvelous phrase in an article last year. He said, we are living through what he called, and I quote, the fag end of the Enlightenment, unquote. That's so true. The Enlightenment was the time with Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and all the others, where, beginning about 3 centuries ago, Western thinkers rejected not only the church, rejected not only revealed religion, but they rejected reason. So that the only way of attaining to truth for them was the scientific method. You know, the idea, the British empiricists, the idea that the only things that are true are those that can be demonstrated empirically to be true, and that's absurd because you can't demonstrate that statement empirically. And the whole thing, the whole enterprise is absurd. But what it is a checking of the brains at the door, and it amounts to a capitulation, a rejection of reason. That's why in free speech cases in the United States, in pornography cases, that's why our courts are unable to tell the difference between Shakespeare and pornography. Because who knows? If the only way to attain to truth is by the scientific method, you have to get all the data together. And who knows? It may turn out that pornography is better than Hamlet. Who knows? Who can tell? And we're living through the tail end of that. So you have secularism, you have this relativism, and this working out of the Enlightenment, which involves really man making himself God. Do you know that? There's nothing new about all this. This is Genesis. As Thomas points out, Thomas Aquinas, 1225, 1274, graduate of Notre Dame Law School, incidentally. I had him in torts. Got a B. Yeah. But as Thomas points out, you know, in the Garden of Eden, when it says knowledge of good and evil, knowledge, know there means to determine. That's the sin that's the original sin. The malicious choice, willful choice to determine what is good and evil, that is to be God. And that's what we are now. And you have 3 elements. You have secularism, you have relativism, which leads to legal positivism. And this whole idea of man being God leads to the 3rd element, which nobody wants to talk about. Everybody tiptoes around. As contraception. The contraceptive ethic. The Playboy philosophy. You're familiar with this isn't a Catholic thing. I'm not giving you some kind of sectarian thing. You may recall that until 1930, until the Anglican Lambeth Conference in 1930, there was never a single Christian denomination that ever had said that contraception could ever, ever, ever be objectively right. When I talk about objective right, I mean the objective moral order. I'm not talking about subjective culpability. We can't judge that. That's up to God and the confessor. But it's true. The laws against contraception in the United States, which have been struck down by the courts lately, were enacted by Protestant legislatures. Why? Because it unravels society. You put those three things together. Put together the rejection of God's law, the idea that nobody can know what's right or wrong. Then you put together this. On the one hand, it involves the separation of the unitive and procreative aspects of sex, but on a more basic level. Again, it's not a sectarian point. But on a more basic level, John Paul II had it right when he said in 1983 that through the exercise of that act, through the practice of that act, couples make themselves arbiters of the beginning of life. That's the crucial point. That's the point that goes back to the Enlightenment. It's a point of dominion. The question is, who's in charge? You put all those three things together and you look around, you got all these things going on, you know, and they all fit together. It's really simple. Promiscuity, for example. Well, you know, in the natural order of things, the main reason why sex is reserved for marriage is because sex has something to do with babies. And children ought to be brought up in a stable marriage. But if sex has nothing to do with babies, it's entirely up to us whether to determine whether it does. And if God's law doesn't count, and if nobody can know what's right or wrong anyway, why does sex have to be reserved for marriage? The same thing with divorce. In the natural order of things, the main reason why marriage is permanent is because marriage has something to do with babies. And babies, children, should be raised in a permanent monogamous marriage. If you want a mind-blowing exposition of that, although the author reaches bugs out on the conclusion at the end, in my opinion. Read this past Sunday's New York Times, the magazine. You may have it in your library. The Sunday magazine, there's a 7 or 8 page article on the children of divorce. This is a survey taken of these children, not immediately after divorce, but children from the most stable families of divorce. And the survey was taken 5 and 10 years later, and the authors said we were stunned because they were not opponents of divorce. But you understand, if sex has no inherent relation to babies, it's up to us to decide when it will have any relation to life. Then why does marriage have to be permanent? See? You look through these problems that we talk about so often, you know, the pornography. Like I don't know anything about that. I don't even own a pornograph. But you take pornography. What is that? Pornography is just the reduction of woman to the status of an object. It's a separation of sex from life. Woman becomes an object. You know that. And that's the inevitable result of these things. Actually, my wife has if I can bring her in again, I should have brought her up, but she had the idea. She had the best idea I've ever heard to handle that problem. We live in Mishawaka, Indiana, and even in Mishawaka, there's an X-rated movie and bookstore, all right? And a few years ago, we had a big red Chevy Suburban, and she used to drive these kids who, under the best of circumstances, are animals, all right? And she'd drive these kids back from school. She'd have 7 or 8 kids in a car. And she'd pass that place. This is great. I mean, she passed that place, and she'd see some guy coming out of that dirty bookstore or out of the X-rated movie. And she'd roll down the window, blow the horn, and wave and keep on going. All right? And you look at the rearview mirror, and you can see this guy looking after that thing. And you know what's going through his mind? I came all the way from Wakarusa, and somebody recognized me. And the thing it did was it kept him away from there for a month anyway. But because he spent the next month trying to figure out who do I know that owns one of those stupid cars. So there are things you can do about that, but let's not make any mistake about it. You put these three things together, you put the secularism, relativism, the Playboy philosophy together, you're going to end up with a pornographic society or the homosexual business. All right? I mean, it used to be that a mixed marriage was a marriage between a Protestant and a Catholic. All right? Now we're talking about a situation where, if you think about it, if sex has no inherent relation to life, and if it is totally our decision whether sex will have any relationship to life, and God's law is excluded, and nobody knows what's right or wrong anyway, why can't Freddie and Harry get a marriage license? Give me a good reason why. The only reason you'll be able to give is aesthetic or arbitrary. Understand? The secular, relativistic, contraceptive society can't deny the legitimacy of homosexual activity without denying itself. You wonder where it's all coming from? That's where it's coming from. And there's no mystery about it. In vitro fertilization, for example. You're talking about, test tube babies. Incidentally, whenever you start talking about the beginning of life, life begins at conception, remind them about Louise Brown, all right? Louise Brown was born in 1978, the first test tube baby. I mean, the whole world knew when her life began, right there on the dish. All right? My mother, the dish. Right? The whole world knew that. In vitro fertilization is taking the procreative while rejecting the unitive. Contraception, of course, is the reverse. And once we adopt in vitro fertilization, inevitably, you have excess embryos. You can freeze them, keep them for later use. Why not? God's law is out. Nobody knows what's right or wrong. And we're in charge. We are the arbiters. And abortion is just one symptom of this thing, see? I mean, it's basically a problem of faith. I mean, our tendency has been in the U.S. for a long time to pretend that abortion as an issue is a political issue, a constitutional issue, not a religious issue, and that's wrong. It is, in its very essence, a religious issue. It is. Because it's the issue of who's God, see? That's what it is. You take the transplants now. We're talking about transplants. The U.S. is moving in irregular ways toward legitimizing, and actually it's not illegitimate under the law, so in a vague posture, but really legitimizing the use of fetal brain tissue and other tissue for transplants, for Alzheimer's patients. There's one doctor in California who talked about the patient who came up to him and she asked him to artificially inseminate her with the sperm of her father, who was an Alzheimer's victim, so that she could conceive a child and abort the child and give the brain tissue to the father to make him better. All right? You tell me if that's not diabolical. But if you look at it, And I'm not throwing rocks at the woman. We're not throwing rocks at people in terms of subjective culpability. But there's no mystery about it. We've lost God, we've lost the knowledge of right and wrong, and we're the masters of life. Well, if you're the master of life as to its beginning, you're going to be the master of life as to its ending. And that's why in the U.S., you already have well established the rule in our major courts, and the AMA endorses this, that when you're dealing with a patient who is irreversibly comatose or in a persistent vegetative state, even though that patient is not dying, and even though that patient is not in any pain, if that patient is incompetent, and you can be awake and conscious, and one of the cases involved an awake and conscious 84-year-old patient, you can be awake and conscious and be incompetent. If that patient is incompetent, the family and the doctors can decide to terminate artificial feeding if they conclude that the benefits of life for that patient are outweighed by the burdens. And it's not surprising, because abortion is simply prenatal euthanasia. And there's no mystery about it. We are heading in the United States to a posture where we are going to regularize that kind of procedure, and the next line of cases is going to be a line of injection cases. I'm running short on time, but let me tell you about one case. Paul Brophy, 48-year-old fireman in Massachusetts, who had a stroke, he had an aneurysm, rather. He went into a coma. The family said, well, he had said that he didn't want to be kept alive like Karen Quinlan. Of course, Karen Quinlan was not a case involving starvation. And I went to the Massachusetts courts, and the highest court of Massachusetts decided 4-3 that Brophy's feeding tubes could be withdrawn. He was not in any significant discomfort, incidentally. His feeding tubes could be withdrawn. And Justice Lynch, in a dissenting opinion, I could read part of it to you here, but let me just tell you about it. Justice Lynch, in a dissenting opinion, said, hey, if you're going to do this, let me tell you about the evidence. And he recited the evidence from the case as to what happens when a patient is starved and dehydrated to death. You recall the Irish hunger strikers. 10 of them in 1981, they lived 50, sometimes 60 days. Why? Because they never went off water and salt. A friend of mine, a priest, went into Bobby Sands the first day of his strike, and he said, Bobby, why don't you go off water and salt? He said, Father, because I don't want to die. I want to protest. And what they did was agonizing. But it's worse when you go off water as well as food and salt, everything. And that's what we're talking about in these cases. And Lynch, Justice Lynch, recited the evidence from the case, from the record, saying what would happen when nutrition and hydration are withdrawn, that is, when you starve and dehydrate to death. And he talked about the shrinking of the tissues and the convulsions, this kind of thing, and the urine concentrates in the bladder and burns from the inside out, things like that. And Lynch said, hey, if you're going to do this, why don't you do the merciful thing, if you're going to do this, and give the guy a painless injection? That's what we do to convicted murderers. Can you imagine the outcry if we decided that we're going to execute a criminal by withdrawing food and water? Can you imagine what the outcry would be? And Lynch's point is correct. And I'll give you a prediction. Prediction is that over the next few years, very few years in the United States, a couple of years, tops, you're going to start getting injection cases. The next big line of cases will be injection cases. And they will relate to elderly people, retarded. They will relate to AIDS patients. And they will be allowed to request the painless injection, and if they don't request it, well, that may indicate that they're not competent and perhaps it ought to be requested for them. Now, that's the way it's going to be. And it's the inevitable outcome of this, and one of the reasons is demographic. We have, give you an example, the total fertility rate for a population to replace itself has to be 2.1. The U.S. has been at 1.7 or 1.8 for 11 years. But don't feel superior, because your fertility rate and your birth rate are lower than ours. All right? Canada, I mean, we have a population density of 68 per square mile, which is really rather moderate. Canada has 6. You know that? 25 million people, a population density of 6. The only example more absurd, which I encountered when I was in Australia on a right to life thing not too long ago, is Australia. They're even less populated than Canada. And perhaps we ought to reflect on what really we're doing to our future. But there's no question but that all these things do hang together. The basic principle is the same as that which underlay the Nazi extermination of the Jews. That's why Leo Alexander, who wrote the seminal treatise on the Nazi extermination program, said in 1984, before I tell you what he said, let me remind you that these things are always for the benefit of the patient. And in the early stages of the psychiatric extermination program in Nazi Germany, Jews were excluded. Did you know that? They were excluded because they were not worthy. Later on, of course, they were found worthy. And Leo Alexander looked at this whole picture in the U.S. In 1984, he said to his friend Joe Stanton, shortly before Alexander died, he said, I quote, "The legal situation in the United States is just like Germany in the 20s and 30s. The legal barriers to killing are being removed. And the same can be said of your situation here." So we're dealing with something where you can't play games with it. There are no exceptions. There is no case, even the life of the mother business. There is no case in practical terms today in medical science where abortion is necessary to save the life of the mother. Operations like the removal of an ectopic pregnancy or a cancerous uterus are not, in terms of the law, legal abortions. There never has been a prosecution even attempted for anything like that. So you don't need an exception for those. Those are independently justified operations, legitimate even under Catholic moral teaching. And once you put the exception in, what you've done, bear this in mind, once you put any exception in there, you have written in the big principle that innocent human beings can be treated as non-persons. Because if your life, you as an innocent person, is subject to destruction at the discretion of others, you're a non-person. And if you're going to do that, believe me, for the little kid in the womb, you're going to do it later on for older people. So let me wind up by suggesting this, that we've got to treat this thing as the basic problem it is. I think the most encouraging factor in the whole, one of the most encouraging factors, is the leadership that's being provided in the United States, and I think here, in major respects, by the evangelical and fundamentalist communities. They always gave us the rap that this is a Catholic issue. Sure, Catholic Church has been strongly teaching against abortion. That's reason to be grateful to God. But it's not a Catholic issue, not a sectarian issue. It's an issue on which, as Senator Jesse Helms in the United States Senate said, he said, this is an issue that can unite Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and so forth, all of us. Because when they talk about a choice, we know what that choice is. But at the same time, let's bear in mind that, we've got to get involved in political action, very definitely. But we're not going to win this thing by political action. We've got to get involved in on-site activity, particularly sidewalk counseling and pregnancy help activity. We've got to get involved in the most important activity, which is prayer. I'm really closing at this point. Just got one other thing I want to mention to you, but this is something that's often misunderstood. I mean, I'm not saying that we ought to go out there and work and work and work and occasionally throw a prayer over our shoulders or sprinkle holy water on our work. I mean that the most effective thing that we can do is to pray. The most practical thing that we can do. Because God is in charge. I mean, all power on heaven and earth has been given to me. He's in charge. He's not dead. He's not even tired, right? And really? Whatever your preference, pray. As far as I'm concerned, the most effective thing we can do is to pray the rosary, because Mary is the mother of life. And you never know what is happening. I'll tell you a true story. This really happened. There's a kid that I knew. She was a college kid, daughter of family that I knew, as a matter of fact, not related. But she was in college, she got pregnant. Her boyfriend, in the finest tradition of the 1980s, talked her into going to another city to get an abortion. This is an actual fact. And she went in there, walked into the abortion place, past the pickets and so forth, and sat down there. She was filling out the forms, and she told me later, she said, suddenly I saw this little nun out there praying the rosary. She said, I said to myself, she's praying for me. And she got up and she walked out. She never said a word to that nun. And that nun probably went home that night and said, boy, I had a lousy day. All right? I didn't do much today. But you never know. That kid now is great. Happiest kid in the world. Had the baby, put the baby up for adoption. He's going to get married. Great. All right? So you trust God. Yeah, you really do. And I think the importance of trusting the Mother of God for all of us, Catholic or whatever, can't be overemphasized, because she is the Mother of life. And I'd like to close by sharing with you a couple of quotations from a couple of prisoners. Prisoners of the communists. They show us some things I think that should help us. One is Father Walter Chizak, a Jesuit who went secretly into the Soviet Union during the Second World War as a priest, and he was arrested and spent 23 years in Siberia before he was exchanged. And he wrote two books. One is With God in Russia, the other, He Leadeth Me. And he said something about trust, And I share it with you. It's a very short little thing. Because sometimes we get so caught up in our own activities, say, we got to do it. We got to do it. Why isn't this turning out the way we want it to be done? And we deliver the instructions to God and we say, okay, do it, all right? And Father Chizek, in a very difficult situation, said, and I quote, said, God's will was not hidden somewhere out there in the situations in which I found myself. The situations themselves were his will for me. What he wanted was for me to accept these situations, for me to accept these situations as from his hands, to let go of the reins and place myself entirely at his disposal. What God wants is an act of total trust, demanding absolute faith, faith in God's existence, faith in his providence, in his concern for the minutest detail, in his power to sustain me, and in his love protecting me, unquote. Sometimes we get intimidated by the other side, and we ought to remember that. The second quote, finally, is from Captain Jim Mulligan, who's a U.S. Navy captain who spent 5 years in the Hanoi Hilton. He was a naval aviator. He was shot down. He was a cellmate of Admiral Jeremiah Denton, who later was a U.S. Senator. For a time, he was a cellmate. And Captain Mulligan, neat guy, he really is. I had the pleasure of having him up to Notre Dame to speak in the Wander Forum. And he was a tough guy. So he was a four-stripe Navy captain. And he knew that the North Vietnamese knew that the whole world knew that Captain Jim Mulligan was there. And he knew it would be an embarrassment for them to have a dead Navy captain on their hands. They tortured him. I mean, really tortured him. For a lot of reasons. He wouldn't break. And he went on hunger strike 4 or 5 times. He said, I'll fix you. He said, you either stop torturing me, or you're going to have a dead Navy captain on your hands. And he was a tough guy. He said the thing that brought him through it was faith. He used to say his rosary by counting the Hail Marys on the barbs, on the barbed wire. You know. He composed a prayer one time, with which I'll conclude. This was during a hunger strike, and I think this is really useful for us because, we do get into the position where we say, well, maybe they're right, maybe we are crazy, maybe we ought to do something else, or how do I know? I mean, everybody else can't be wrong, and you get that kind of feeling. And Captain Mulligan said this. He said, I quote, Lord, give me the strength and the guts to see this thing through to the end, one way or another. No one else knows, Lord, but you and I know, and that's all that's necessary. You suffered for your beliefs, and I must suffer for mine. Right is right if no one's right. Wrong is wrong if everyone's wrong. Unquote. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you very much.